So finally, we are in part 4 of Unit 5, Land and Water Use, and we're going to focus on sustainability in this PowerPoint. Again, here are your um, essential knowledge points. Remember, you want to pause these or go back to these and take a look at these essential knowledge points because these are really the things that you need to know. But anyway, moving on to topic 511, ecological footprint. We did an ecological footprint, and if you remember what it asked you all about your lifestyle and your transportation needs, your house, um, about products, your resource use that you use for products, the types of food that you eat, and all different kinds of parts of your lifestyle. And basically, it's measuring how fast we're consuming these resources and it compare it to how fast nature can actually absorb our waste or generate new resources for us to use. And usually it is not equal. Even if you are in a good place, maybe you use more than one earth. So if everyone on earth lived just like you, how many earths would you need? And more than likely, yours is more than one. But we only have one earth. And so when we look at our ecological footprint, it kind of makes us think about, hey, how can we mitigate what our resource use is doing to them? And so we really want to go towards more sustainability. And again, here are your essential knowledge points about sustainability. Um, but right, you have these indicators of sustainability and looking at how good or bad we're doing at how sustainable our lifestyle is or as a human population really, right? So if we're looking at biological diversity, if you have a high biological diversity, we're doing pretty good. If it's a low biological diversity, not so good, right? Food production, well, food production, if we are feeding the people on Earth, then that's a good thing. But are we doing it sustainably? Um, Looking at our carbon dioxide emissions and climate change, if those are on the lower side, then our sustainability is in a good part, right? We're able to sustain that lifestyle. Whereas if we're going to keep on increasing global temperatures through carbon dioxide emissions, then that's not so sustainable. And so you can take a look at this table. You can see it's directly from your book, table 2.2. And basically, when we talk about sustainability and looking at our resources, we talk about sustainable yield. And it's the amount of a resource that can be taken without reducing the available supply. So if you take too much, there isn't going to be enough later. Um, Whereas if you take too little, there'll be plenty. But as humans, we want to take the maximum amount that we can take and still have plenty of resources left over. And so you want to take the number of resources that's optimal for whatever we're talking about. Here in the picture, it's fish, as we usually talk about, right, when we talk about tragedy of the commons and whatnot. But any resource, so water, timber, whatever it may be. So, one of the ways we can live more sustainably is by reducing our urban runoff. So, we talked about urbanization, and now how do we reduce the amount of runoff that comes from all that impervious surface? And so, really, the answer is to decrease the amount of impervious surface, right? And we can do that through using vegetation, by planting trees in cities and also in deforested areas, obviously. But since we're talking about urban runoff, we'll stick to urban trees. So those trees you see along the sidewalks in New York City aren't just because they look pretty, because they do look pretty, right? But also because they help in reducing the amount of runoff that's going into the stormwater system. You also want to increase the number of green spaces. So having parks and whatnot in urban areas is really important. Building up and not out, and having space left for green instead of paved area. And then, of course, green roofs are also a really great opportunity for water to be taken up instead of letting it run off. And so, with all of the space on top of these buildings, it doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be functional. It doesn't have to be a walkway. It just has to be vegetated. Of course, it's nice if it's pretty in a walkway and, maybe even a garden. But, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Another thing that's pretty cool is called permeable pavement. So on the left there, you see that's basically concrete that's permeable to water, so the water can actually get through the pavement and infiltrate down into the soil, recharge that groundwater. Something a little more simple in the middle there are just pavers with gravel that are big enough to have a high infiltration rate. And then, of course, you can also have grass pavers. So these pavers that allow, space to natural space underneath it. Another way to reduce urban runoff is, like I said before, building up, not out. So building high rises, like high rises, instead of, 3 floors or even 10 floors, you're looking at, 20s, 30s, 40s, hundreds, and so you have fit the same amount of people in one physical footprint than in an individual house. And think about that many people spread out over the landscape. And so your actual physical footprint is less building up. And then, of course, if people take public transportation and you have a really good public transportation system, you don't need as many roadways because not so many people are coming in their individual cars, right? You have more mass transit, whether it's buses or trains, right? All of those are maximizing the roads and reduces the need to make more roads. Another way to stay sustainable is something through integrated pest management. And this is really in terms of agriculture, but we'll talk about it a little bit later in terms of forestry. But basically, integrated pest management is just using any way possible to get rid of your pests. Remember, a pest is anything that you don't want. And using pesticide as the last resort. Basically, you have this systems approach, right? You're looking at all different ways of managing your pests and combining those pest control methods to, without using actual chemical pesticides. So, like I said, integrated pest management uses many techniques, right? You're integrating many different techniques to suppress these pests. And so we're going to go over some of these in detail, such as biocontrol, crop rotation. But, you just monitor your population, and maybe the pests aren't so bad and you don't have to do anything. Or maybe you want to bring in some different habitats, such as some marigolds to bring in ladybugs, and the ladybugs eat the pests that you don't want. Or, genetically modified organisms, you would definitely, you're not using chemicals. So that's part of integrated pest management. No-till agriculture, which we'll talk about more. And also just physically picking your pests off of your plants, or weeding, right, is mechanical pest removal. But you can see in this graph that Indonesia did a pretty good job. They actually increased their yield, which is a stark difference than when you looked at the pesticide treadmill. You're increasing the amount of pesticide that you're actually using, and then you still have the same amount that you get, the same yield from your crop. so it worked in Indonesia. Looking a little further in detail into these methods, you could do interplanting where there are different mixtures of plants, so in different rows or even within rows. And what it does is increases diversity. And so if you have more diversity, it's less likely for a pest to get so large that you're having trouble managing it. Right, with diversity um, becomes resistance. If I have a crop of all of the same thing, then I'm going to have a lot of pests, and it's not going to be very manageable. Um, Strip cutting, where I'm not harvesting my plants all at the same time. I'm cutting them down in strips instead of all at once. Proper timing of planting, fertilizing and irrigating. It could be a climate thing where certain pests like certain conditions, or maybe it could be timing of maybe when certain pests are mating or pollinating or right seed dispersal, whatever it may be. If I time my crops around them, then maybe I won't have the pest issue. Crop rotation is great because let's say, for example, I have tomatoes, which is a fruit. Did you know it was a fruit? Now you do, right? So it's a fruit down in that lower right quadrant there in my picture. And let's say I have aphids and they love tomatoes. And then I, harvest my tomatoes and I cut all my foliage down or my crop debris and I leave it there because I'm doing nice sustainable agricultural methods. And then the next year I plant beets there. But the aphids that are still in that foliage don't like beets, and so my beets will be fine, and they don't affect my tomatoes because my tomatoes are now growing where my spinach was, and spinach doesn't have that problem. And so if I rotate it through, then the pests that were there before are not going to affect the type of plant that is there now. Also, crop rotation is fabulous for nutrients because legumes are nitrogen fixers. And so you have very nitrogen rich soil and you rotate that through to kind of re up the nitrogen on each of those beds. But not to mention, the different kinds of plants are also using different kinds of nutrients. Good stuff all around. Moving on to biological control. Biological control, is basically we're using some sort of natural predator or parasite or disease or whatever to actually control our pest organism. But you need to take care that the agent actually doesn't attack any unintended hosts so that it doesn't ripple outwards. And so biological controls are great, but problem being is that they can become pests themselves. The Australian cane toad, if you want to see a funny movie, you should go on YouTube and watch the movie Cane Toads. It's actually really funny. Take my word, or don't, whatever. Basically, they introduced these cane toads to get rid of a pest, and the cane toads became pests themselves. And this is an example of not being able to predict the effects of an introduced species. There are so many little strings attached to each organism that there's no way to really know. So they have to be like very, very, very well tested before they're actually released. Another problem could be that the agent may have a non-target effect, meaning that what I release my biological control for may actually have an effect on something that I do want. And that's not good either. And so removing a biocontrol agent is harder than stopping pesticides. So biological controls are great, but they need to be seriously, seriously tested, planned, and regulated. So moving on to sustainable agriculture. One thing we want to do when we're looking at agriculture is to reduce erosion. So one way that we can do that is something called no-till agriculture, or not tilling the soil, so not turning it over. And basically, you're just leaving the residue from last year's crops in place. And so by doing so, it's just preventing soil erosion. And that's not only just for crops, but also for your cover crop, where you're, you know, actually planting something to keep your to keep roots in place to reduce that erosion. Contour plowing, if you must plow, um, you're plowing with the contours of the land instead of straight up and down to make it look neat and tidy. You're making it um, more organic around the landscape. And then terracing also reduces erosion because the water won't go down a straight slope. Instead, right, it's slowed down by that terraced landscape. Strip cropping is another way to conserve soil. Sorry, and by alternating different crops along different contours, um, you are again following the contour, which is going to reduce erosion. Windbreaks are rows of trees that are planted to reduce the wind erosion. So instead of the wind just whipping across land, those trees are actually slowing that wind down and protecting the crops. Another way to conserve soil is using perennial crops, so crops that are growing back from year to year. And when you do that, those roots are going to stay in place and actually form quite a network. So I love this picture. On the bottom here, you can see you have annual wheat on the left, and then you have wheatgrass on the right. And so when I plant it as an annual, right, every single year, right, I'm not getting that network of roots. Whereas if you have a perennial plant, those roots are already in place and they just grow more and more, locking that soil in and reducing erosion. So soil fertility is another important part of sustainable agriculture. I talked about crop rotation, so I'm actually not going to go over it again, but basically, when you're rotating crops, different plants use different nutrients, so it'll keep the soil fertility up. Um, there's something called green manure. Sounds gross, but it's actually just old plants, right? So you're leaving that crop residue, or such as a cover crop, on top of your fields, and that is used as mulch, and it's breaking down into the soil and feeding those microorganisms in the soil to help um, to help go through nitrification and allow for lots of good nitrogen into the next year's crops. And then actually the use of limestone is common for soil fertility. Sometimes when soil gets too acidic, the bacteria don't like that, and so by neutralizing soil acidity, those bacteria get really happy. Not just in crops, right? Agriculture also includes the animals that we eat. And so by rotating your livestock, you are avoiding overgrazing. And so the Ohio Valley resource, there's a hyperlink there you can click on. But this is their graphic. I really like it. You should definitely read through it. But basically, you have animals. Doesn't have to be cows. It can be chickens too, right? Right? They're cordoned off to one area, and as they graze down the grass, they get moved over into the next area so that the other area can recover. So aquaculture is another form of agriculture, only this time we're growing fish. And aquaculture is great because right, it's reducing the amount of overharvesting of our oceans. And so that's not good. But, aquaculture also obviously has its issues. But basically, aquatic species are raised in some sort of pen or pond or even nets. So depending on what you're growing, so there's fish, mollusks. So if you're looking at oysters and clams, mussels, aquatic plants, so your seaweed that you're eating, crustaceans, shrimp, all of these things that we eat that come from the water, um, we can we can culture. And so aquaculture is booming right now, and obviously it's the most widespread in Asia because the Asian diet is very, very fish heavy. There are lots of benefits, lots of drawbacks. Um, there's a reliable protein source if we are growing fish or really aquatic life. It's sustainable mostly. It reduces fishing pressure. It's energy efficient sometimes. And it also requires relatively small areas of land and water. Whereas lots of diseases can occur. It can require antibiotics or other diseases like sea lice can occur when you have organisms in high densities. The farm fish could escape, so then you have issues with wild fish, whether they're breeding with wild fish or introducing their disease to the wild fish. So that's not good. And also, a lot of times in aquaculture, you're feeding the organisms at different trophic levels than they're usually consuming in the wild. So you end up with much different product. And then you also have this large amount of waste that can either pollute nearby waters or just have to be dealt with in some way and treated. So finally, we're going to talk about sustainable forestry. So we obviously are going to use lumber, but how can we do that sustainably? And so one way to mitigate what's already been done is to replant or reforest deforested areas. We could reuse wood to decrease the amount of wood that we're actually using. And also we could buy from companies that are using sustainable methods. So what does sustainable methods actually look like? Well, if an area has been clear cut, you can actually plant them with plantations. And so you end up with a stand of trees that are all the same age. These are sun tolerant species, and then you can clear cut them all again and plant them again. So you're actually, growing trees to be cut down. There's also selective cutting, so where you're removing a smaller number of trees at a time, and then your stand is different ages, so you might be able to harvest in the same area at different times. This is really only good for shade-tolerant species because obviously you have trees that are left that are providing shade for your new trees. And sustainable forestry really is just harvesting trees in a way that allow these species to regenerate and ensure that the ecological health is maintained and restored, and maybe even enhanced. Imagine that, that'd be awesome. And so, depending on where you are in the world, your harvest plan is going to be different. For example, small scale clear cutting is actually not so bad in deciduous forest areas. That's where we are, because it's mimicking natural disturbance, small scale. Whereas, right, other areas that might not be very good. But another thing in a plan, a sustainable forestry plan, is you really need to think about the number of trees that are harvested per acre to keep your forest healthy and happy. Um, how often can you harvest a certain species? Some species grow faster than others. And then also any logging techniques to minimize impacts. You can hand cut your trees, or some companies are actually going to like horse and buggies to bringing um, the lumber out of the forest, so that way they don't have to build roads. So, right, these are sustainable ways that you can actually harvest lumber products. Another thing to manage your forest is using something called a prescribed burn. So you want to make sure that the biomass underneath your canopy is burned off. So natural fires are actually a thing. and they're good in small scales, and it actually keeps the amount of biomass down. And so it reduces that risk of uncontrolled fires. But another plus about this is that it adds nutrients to the soil. So it allows for early succession species, which increases biodiversity. And obviously, adding nutrients to the soil is never a bad thing. So, obviously, when you're managing a forest, there's going to be some pests, and you want to keep your trees healthy and safe and harvestable. And so, there are different ways of integrating pest management, IPM, right, in forestry. One of them is cultural. Maybe you've seen these um, signs around, right? First, you're like preventing organisms from coming into our forests. So this is why we don't use out of state firewood, or it's restricted in a lot of areas, because you don't want organisms from other places in your forest because they may become invasive, like this little guy called the emerald ash borer. You can say he gets his name because he's green, or maybe it's a she. I don't actually know how to sex a beetle, but and they bore these ash trees. Ash is a very good wood for retail purposes, and so you do not want your ash getting affected by these guys, and ultimately they will kill the tree because you can see what they do underneath their bark there, and so basically things that you can do if you do have an introduced species is, or just a pest that you don't want, is by removing affected trees, so cutting down trees that are affected so it doesn't spread. Using biocontrols. One thing they're using for the emerald ash borer is actually some parasitoid from Asia. So basically it's this, I don't even know what it is, but it's a parasite that um, basically lays its larva inside of the emerald ash borer and kills it. And then any biopesticides. I don't actually know of a biopesticide for an emerald ash borer, but it can be like using a bacteria spray to get rid of um, some sort of pest. So thus concludes sustainable land and water use. And I told you it was a doozy.